Hey, Food Justice. Welcome to a video recording of the SNAP and CalFresh lecture that I had in class. Some of you may have missed this class because of APs or other conflicts, so this is your chance to get caught up. So let's just jump right in. We're going to be talking about SNAP, which is a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. SNAP is the federal program. Then there is CalFresh, and that is the same program, but administered at a local level. It's administered through a state level, but you may commonly know it as food stamps. So let's just jump right into some history. So a quick history of SNAP, 1930. This should all come back to you around from our corn units when we talked about the fact that farmers were faced with this dilemma that they were producing food, but there was no one to buy it. The food stamp program was launched at a time when our nation was facing a tragic paradox. One, millions of Americans were suffering from hunger during the Great Depression. And two, the country's farmers are agonized under a crushing bounty. So 1930s, as you remember, economic depression, food consumers no longer had any purchasing power. What does that mean? It means that they didn't have money to buy food. There was food, but there was no one to buy it, right? Because in 1930s, economic collapse, folks are just destitute. Farmers found themselves with an excess of crops and livestock, and that sent agricultural prices plummeting. So what does the federal government do? This is Franklin D. Roosevelt. This is his administration. And his first idea, the first attempt at fixing this, is paying farmers to plow their fields and slaughter their livestock and then just throw it away, right? He says to do this because he wants to create an artificial scarcity to boost prices. If you reduce the amount of commodities, right? If you reduce the amount of food that there is, it becomes more valuable. Okay, so that's strategy number one. However, Americans are horrified when they find that this is happening, that during a time with so much hunger, there's all this food waste that's happening at the direction of the federal government. So Americans are up in arms and they're like, this just simply can't be. All right, then enters the New Deal. More specifically, enters the Federal Surplus Commodities Commission in 1933. And the role of this commission is to purchase excess food and distribute it directly to the needy, right? Which is almost everyone. So the government comes and says, hey, farmers, stop throwing away your crops. We're going to buy the crops from you, and then we're going to give it out to Americans because they're facing hunger. Great, sounds great. It's basically a federal food pantry, except if you own a grocery store or if you're a food wholesaler, right? Because you're still buying food from those same farmers, but you're trying to sell it. So now the federal government is your competitor in the marketplace, and they're selling the products that you're buying, but they're selling it for free. They're just giving it away. So grocery store chains, grocery stores, food manufacturers, or food wholesalers are saying, you know what, federal government, you can't do this. And so they're in a real dilemma, right? There's a 17% unemployment rate in the country, and you have three sectors to think about. How do you figure this out? One, you have consumers who are hungry but have no purchasing power. Two, you have farmers with an excess of food. And then three, you have food manufacturers and retailers who need to be able to sell food. Okay, so enter 1939, the debut of the food stamp. The food stamp, and I'm going to show you a picture of this. Here we go. The food stamp, interestingly, oh, my face covers it. It says food stamps are an act of patriotism. And it was piloted in, what year did I say? 1939. It was piloted in Rochester, New York. And the way the program worked was the federal government said, hey, listen, we're going to sell you these stamps. And for every orange stamp, you buy it for each stamp is $1, right? We'll give you 50 cents of blue stamps. And the way the setup is, so if you're a consumer, this is very intriguing to you because for every dollar that you spend, you get $1.50 worth of credit for food. So orange stamps could be used to buy any food. So you go to the grocery store and stock up on everything you need. You say, let me buy those orange stamps and trade them in for food. Great. The blue stamps didn't allow you to buy any food that you want. In fact, those were determined, the foods that you could buy with the blue stamps were determined by the government. And those were often the commodities that they were buying, but they were valuable. So it's like butter, eggs, cornmeal. Remember, corn always leads to corn, beans, fruit. So great. As a consumer, I'm really happy about this because I can go out and buy my stamps, get the 50% boost on everything that I'm buying, and walk away with the foods that I need. And as a consumer, I'm patriotic for doing so. This was a program that was so celebrated and just welcomed by the American public as like, this country is so great. Like even in a time of economic disaster, we have a safety net program designed and administered by our government that ensures that American people have food on the table. And if you take a close look at the image I'm showing you here is actually from Rochester. And if you look at that sign, it's pretty interesting. It's orange and blue food stamps redeemed here. And then if you look closely, it says, we are helping the farmers of America. And that's really important to note because when food stamps were first unrolled, this was wonderful and everybody got behind it. The pilot program in Rochester began with 1,200 stores and then it just went from there and it grew and it expanded. And it was great because the grocers that they could take those stamps and then go to a bank, any commercial bank or an FSCC office and exchange those stamps for money, right? So that's how they were able to get their revenue. It was incredible. In fact, the program fed 20 million Americans, right? So it worked. People got what they needed, their most basic needs. And then finally in 1943, the food stamp program ends. World War II begins. And as you might remember from your history classes, with the beginning of World War II began this economic stimulus, right? One, we were using our commodities. Farmers were using the food that they were growing or slaughtering or whatever, all the food to go to our soldiers abroad. I remember we talked about victory gardens. Americans started to garden and grow some of their own food as a way to demonstrate patriotism, as a way to support troops. So Americans became self-sufficient in trying to grow their own food to help offset the need for food. And then there was a big industrial boom. We were building and manufacturing a lot of machinery and tools around that would help support our troops abroad during World War II. So World War II ends the program, right? We can move into this period of time where the United States enjoys economic stability. Great. Then things change. After World War II, we start to see a decline economically. We're not enjoying that same boost as we start to move into the 60s. Interestingly, we have two really important campaigns that happen. The first one is JFK. So John Fitzgerald Kennedy is running for office, and he goes on a tour during 1960 as part of his campaign, and he goes to West Virginia. And he's struck by the level of poverty that he had witnessed in West Virginia. This is a time where the United States was much more provincial than it is now, in the sense that they didn't have the internet. We didn't have access to information what was happening in other parts of the country. People lived very locally. And so during the campaign, he goes to West Virginia and he sees people really suffering, and hunger is something that stands out to him. So one of his campaign promises is that he is going to bring back food stamps. And this speaks to a lot of people. He's elected into office. 1961, one of his first actions is bringing back the program. Unfortunately, in 1963, we know that JFK is assassinated. However, 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson, who was his predecessor, who was vice president, he signed the Food Stamp Act of 1964 into law. Okay, so we bring food stamps back in the 1960s. And while recipients are still required to pay for food stamps, the special stamps for surplus goods were eliminated. So the blue stamps, remember those? Those are gone. Now it's just one stamp and you can buy whatever food that you need. Okay. And so what's really interesting about this is, again, we see that like patriotism, right? People voted for this. They wanted to expand it. It's something we don't see a whole lot anymore. The expansion of these safety net programs. We don't hear presidential candidates talk about how they want to expand welfare. In fact, I would argue that more recently we hear about politicians trying to find ways to cut those programs. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Another thing that happens is in 1968, there is a groundbreaking report by CBS News. And let's watch a little clip of it. Okay, so let's go back. Um, so this report that came out of CBS News was groundbreaking. It rocked the nation. They went to different parts of the country. They went to Alabama. They went to Arizona very specifically. They went to a reservation in Arizona. They went to San Antonio, as you just saw, and then they went to Virginia. And people were flabbergasted, truly. Like they had no idea that this kind of poverty existed in these communities, especially with hunger. This documentary, you can find it on YouTube. I'll put it on my Marlboro, but I will share. It's really shocking. Like, one of the first scenes they show is a baby that dies from malnutrition. I mean, it's a very raw, hard documentary, but at the time it was groundbreaking. It won the Peabody Award, and really it brought this conversation to Americans. How can we be the richest nation in the country and have babies dying from starvation? And so it changed a lot of that. I wouldn't say, maybe it didn't change the conversation. It opened up the conversation to what hunger looks like in this country. And with that also, as I mentioned, was JFK's visit to the Mississippi Delta and Appalachia. MLK had his Poor People's Campaign. People just had this awareness of poverty in this country that they didn't have before. And it was alarming. So this is all happening. This report comes out in 1968, and it's also a campaign year. And interestingly, it's Richard Nixon who's running for president, and he uses this as a big part of his campaign, that it is simply un-American to have people living in these conditions, to be experiencing starvation in a country as great and mighty as the United States. So Nixon goes on to win the election, and he is like the grandfather of conservatism in this country. I mean, that's what he's known for. And what's so interesting is that the food stamp program grew fivefold during his administration. So in 1969, there were 3 million people receiving these benefits. And by the time he left office in 1974, there were 15 million people. We went from 3 million people to 15 million people. So it was interesting that, you would almost never hear of a Republican president or any elected official expanding these benefit programs in such a way that Richard Nixon did. And why did that happen? So let's take a look past this. So there are some really big dates and numbers here, but I just want to highlight a few. The person who really, I think, can be credited or noted for changing the way people perceive these welfare benefits. I would argue there's actually two. The first is Reagan, and we'll take a look at this. Reagan, during his campaign, really kind of he presented people who receive government aid as people who were taking advantage of the system. And this is something we still hear today. We still hear these notions that people who receive government benefits are lazy, they don't work, they're just taking advantage, they're asking for a handout. Like, does this sound familiar to you? They're immigrants, they're people of color who don't want to do them. They need to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, et cetera, et cetera. And he really changed the way people perceived Americans who received these benefits. The other one I think it's worth noting is Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton came in 1996, and he rolled out major welfare reforms. So he cut back the food stamp program significantly. I think his legacy is welfare to work. So this notion that you shouldn't be receiving welfare benefits if you're not working. Okay, but it's a pretty broad statement. So it leaves out people like senior citizens. I think senior citizens are people who either cannot work, or they're not desirable candidates, right? If they are applying for jobs. The disabled. Again, we see a lot of barriers for disabled people to access jobs, and women with children. So women with children, yes, it sounds great to work, but how do you pay for childcare? And how do you arrange all of that? You know, if you don't have a car, how do you get transportation? How do you drop off your child at a childcare facility, assuming you can pay for it, and then go to work and all of this to get yourself off welfare is it's a mighty ask of a mom. And so I would say that the combination of the Reagan sort of changing the norm and of how we perceive welfare recipients, and then Bill Clinton's welfare to work program really hammered in this notion that people who receive government aid don't work, and they're taking advantage of the system. Something that really changed this introduced the concept of the welfare queen. If you've ever heard that term, the welfare queen, this is where it comes from. So let's take a look. Okay, so that is such an important distinction that he makes between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. In 1933, we roll out food stamps as a program, and it is celebrated, and we embrace it as this act of patriotism, and that we care for our poor. And in 1983, we are scapegoating Black people as draining us from our resources. How did we go from a celebration, this sort of act of patriotism, to scapegoating Black folks, immigrants, mothers, single mothers? We were just putting these labels on them that they were these welfare queens, right? That they were getting away with just sucking the government dry of resources and living this very lavish life. Now, I do want to note, Linda Taylor was a criminal. What she did was criminal, ethically wrong. She had multiple social security numbers and identities, so she had different welfare programs that she was tapping into with different names and aliases. So she was benefiting greatly from this. But this is one woman. And that was her crime. It was a ripple effect of how people started to perceive the people who receive welfare. And I think what's important is that we need to remember the people who do receive this, the folks who don't have access to financial stability include the working poor. If you're working at a fast food joint and you're living in the city of Los Angeles, you are simply not making enough money to survive. You need government assistance to be able to feed yourself. I mean, you think about the irony of working at a restaurant but not being able to have enough money to eat. And then also military families, veterans, they receive these benefits as well. And, there's sort of, it's so patriotic to be a veteran, and yet they're being critiqued for, draining the economy, tapping into these resources, and basically being freeloaders. So the welfare queen is presented in campaigns as this Black woman who, is gaining from the system, but really it dives into other populations as well. And I think, what's important about this is, it changes the way we think about who welfare recipients are, and we have to unpack all these myths, right? Like, this one woman really changed the way we thought about it. But really, when we look at who is traffic, what are the trafficking rates of SNAP benefits, it's 1%. It's 1%. It's a program where, of all the millions of dollars that are given out, 1% are used incorrectly. And by trafficking, what I mean by that are those are people who say get benefits. So let's say I apply for benefits and I get $200 a month, and I sell my benefits to somebody for $150 cash. And again, even with that, there's like this assumption like, well, why do you need cash? Are you using it to buy drugs? Are you using it to buy, to participate in illegal activities? I mean, you have to really step back and wonder why a low-income person would forego benefits for cash. Why is it they need the cash so badly? And so I think just, really step back from this lecture and this work is to really rethink who is the deserving poor and who are the undeserving poor in this country. When we break down the numbers of who receives SNAP benefits nationwide, just demographics based on race, the majority of people who are receiving SNAP benefits are white. It's by far the largest population of people, right? And as we saw historically with the New Deal and coming out of the Depression, there was sort of that deserving poor. We see an increase in the number of Black and African Americans who receive it. Now they're at 26%. Hispanic and Latinos are at 16%. That's a very small percentage. We know that undocumented people, especially undocumented people who are coming from South Central Mexico, coming to the United States, don't have access to these programs. So again, this idea that people are these, immigrants, these undocumented immigrants are coming and stealing our resources is simply false, because they can't. And in fact, in the United States, after you do obtain a legal residency, there's a 5-year wait period before you can apply for these programs. So even after, if you were to follow the rules and the systems in which you need to be able to obtain legal status in this country, you still have to wait 5 years before you can tap into these programs, which means you're paying the taxes and everything, that pays into these programs, but you won't benefit them, not for at least 5 years. So this is what it looks like nationwide demographically. And I'm actually going to jump. Who receives it in California? These are households. And so 61% of households that receive SNAP here in California, it's called CalFresh, and I'll explain that in a second, are families with children. So that means there's a child in the house who needs these benefits to obtain food to grow. The other populations we see high numbers are seniors and disabled. Again, these are two populations. Seniors and disabled folks are, for them to just simply get a job and pick themselves up by the bootstraps is an impossible ask. So 19% of people who receive SNAP and have a senior or a disabled person in their household. 40% of the households that receive CalFresh are the working poor. That means they have jobs. It means that they have jobs that they're not paid enough to be able to buy food, not in a secure way. So the working poor. And then finally, the total state population. So 12% of Californians are receiving CalFresh. How does this all work? So Congress approves the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill, you may have heard of, I know referenced in other lessons, is the budget for the USDA. Congress SNAP is a line item in the Farm Bill, right? So Congress approves it, becomes law. The USDA administers it with the states. So the USDA sees it at a federal level, and then they're like, this is too big for us to be running state to state. So California, you're going to run it on your own. And California calls it CalFresh. So it's called SNAP at a federal level. It's called CalFresh at a local level. Even California, it's so big. So California is like, listen, as a state, we can't administer this program on our own. So we're going to actually bring it down to a county level. So if you were to apply for SNAP benefits, if you were to apply for CalFresh in Los Angeles, you would go to a County of Los Angeles office. Okay, that's how that works. So sometimes you'll hear about like it's a city thing. It's not a city thing. It's a county administered federal program. Okay. If you qualify for the program, you get an EBT card so you can shop at authorized retailers. So sometimes you'll see at grocery stores or you'll see restaurants that say EBT accepted here. What that means is they will take your benefits as a form of payment. Certain restaurants, you'll see that EBT sign, and they distinguish themselves because in the County of Los Angeles, if you qualify for CalFresh, you can receive benefits, which means if I am a 2-person household and I'm earning $750 a month, I get up to $260 a month. And I can use that, and it's in the form of a credit card, to go to a grocery store. Think of it as like a prepaid credit card. I can go to a grocery store and buy all the groceries that I need, but it cannot be food that has already been cooked. So I can't go and buy a rotisserie chicken. I can buy raw chicken. I can buy everything that I need to cook a meal, but I can't buy any prepared foods. However, if you can demonstrate that you don't have access to a kitchen, you can get a special exemption that allows you to buy prepared foods, which means you can go to those restaurants, the KFC, the Carl's Jr., and get the sign with the EBT. You can go buy your meals there because you've demonstrated that you don't have access to a kitchen, which means that either maybe you rent a room somewhere, and that doesn't mean you have access to the whole house. Maybe it means that you're homeless. Maybe it means you're transient, like, you're here this week, next month you may be somewhere else. But you have a need to buy prepared foods. Okay, so those are sort of the two categories that exist within them. I mentioned the EBT card. So just to give you a little background on that, food stamps, as you saw, used to be stamps. And then as we moved into the 80s, the stamps sort of got bigger and bigger. And so when you were in line at a grocery store, if you had to use your food stamps, you really had to kind of sort of stop the line, tear off the stamps that you needed to be able to pay for the food. And in some cases, it was humiliating, right? Because you had people behind you and you were trying to tear your stamps, and then people would really critique out loud, oh, you have your nails done. Remember Ashley from Fruits of Labor, the 16-year-old farm worker? And we talked about her nails. People would hear things like, oh, you have your nails done, but you're getting food stamps. Welfare queen. Oh, you have children with you and you're paying with food stamps. Go get a job. Welfare queen. Right? It's a really interesting, people become very open in public about the way they feel about it. So to reduce, you really open yourself up to fraud if you're using paper, as you know, but also to sort of streamline and move away from that. California and other states now will give you what looks like a Visa, like a credit card, and you can use that to swipe at the counter. Like I said, it's like a prepaid credit card. It gets filled every month. You get like your, in this case, $260 every month, and you can use it. So it's sort of like more discreet. But it's amazing how the ramifications of that welfare queen really, it changed the way we operate the program today. So we looked at this. What's important to know about food stamps as well is that food stamps are an economic boost, right? So imagine we had 15% increase to food stamps, right? That would result in a $467 million economic boost. And this doesn't mean that people get this money and squirrel it away and keep it to themselves. They have to spend it. It's not cash. And so that means they go to the grocery store, they buy the groceries that they need, they They buy what they need from the stores, which is an economic boost for the store. The food retailers, you know enough about food retailers now to understand the entire production line that happens. Like how that piece of chicken ends up at that grocery store involves a lot of different hands. And the ripple effects of somebody spending that money really kind of opens up, and it's an economic boost for many people, not just the welfare recipients, but the food producers, the grocery store outlets, right? An economic boost for everyone. We want people spending money, but they need money to spend money. And so in some cases, it's not as simple as just spending money. They need that aid. And this is an aid that buys them, something like frivolous. It buys them food. It's a basic human need. And that's a very important distinction as well. I think we have to sort of dismantle a little bit of that idea that people are gaining or benefiting off these programs in a way that gives them access to this like lavish, luxurious life. Next slide. Okay, I think I'm back. Sorry, I had to move my little screen thing guy. Okay, anyways. I want to leave you with some discussion questions that we had in class. I know you weren't able to be there, but it's still worth going through these questions just for your own reflection, and to think about this further. So the first one is, given that many people in poverty are working, right? The numbers, they don't lie. We've seen the number of working poor who receive these benefits. In California, we know that 40% of CalFresh recipients have somebody in the household that is working. Why do these perceptions still exist? I know you know about the welfare queen now and the ramifications of that one unfortunate incident, but the numbers don't lie. People have access to numbers in a way that they can just simply Google things, right? You can simply Google to see who receives SNAP benefits. And yet these perceptions still exist that people who receive welfare are lazy and mooching off the government. And why do you think that still exists? The second question is, sometimes people get angry or they're irritated that people who are receiving welfare benefits have access to, maybe they have a nice car or a nice phone, or they're using SNAP benefits to purchase things that may seem like luxurious or frivolous. I don't know, cupcakes and crab legs is what I have here, but even just, sodas or snacks, like why aren't they using their SNAP benefits to buy, healthy food, fruits and vegetables? Do you think that this is justified? Why or why not? Can you identify reasonable possibilities why individuals on welfare may have some of these nice things? I think it's worth sharing. In class, we discussed, this is the topic we really got into in class. And I want to take us back to Ashley from Fruits of Labor. Remember our very first unit on farms and farm labor, and that she was a 16-year-old girl who wanted to get her nails done for prom. And yet that was a moment where people really critiqued like her choice to spend money on getting her nails done. And the question really comes down to, do the poor deserve luxury? Do they deserve recreation? I think it's also worth examining, things like the car. Like you have a nice car, but yet you receive government benefits without looking deeper into that. For example, is that car also a source of income for somebody? Are they using that car to work as an Uber or a driver for somebody else? I mean, things that present, as suspicious or wrong sometimes require a little more digging before we make these really dangerous assumptions. But I think it's really worth thinking about this question. This is the one that I know our class really got into, because it is this idea that, low-income people don't deserve recreation or nice things. And interestingly, I want to share that when you look at, I should have created a slide for this, but when you look at the types of foods that people use their SNAP benefits to buy, it's not great food. It's processed food, frozen meals, soda, chips, snacks. It's not healthy. When you look at the foods that Americans buy in the grocery stores, non-benefit, people paying out of pocket for groceries, they are buying chips, soda, frozen foods, processed foods, snacks. It's exactly the same food. So, why are we putting this expectation on people who receive benefits when it's an expectation that we can't even meet ourselves? So, something to think about. And then finally, the last question is, do you think there should be a time limit on these type of welfare benefits? Should a person be allowed to be on these benefits for the rest of their lives? What might be some restrictions that you would put to keep them on, or I'm sorry, to take them off those benefits? And is it more of a case by case issue? So that's what I'm going to leave you with. You don't have to write an essay or do anything around it, but I do think it's worth even just giving this some thought today, just pausing maybe after this lecture on how you think you would respond to these, because that's the critical thinking. That's where the learning really happens. Okay, thank you for sitting through with me on this one. I know it was a long one, but I definitely think it was worth recording because I feel so strongly about demystifying and debunking really dangerous myths around SNAP, around CalFresh and these benefits and the idea of who receives welfare and who doesn't and what it really does. It's just really important to me. So thank you for taking the time to learn about this issue. And there is some homework associated with it. You'll see it in the assignment center. It's fairly easy. What I'm asking students to do is look at a CalFresh application. It's daunting when you open it. It's 30 pages long. But what I'm asking you to do is just skim the application and pull out 3 things that really surprised you about the application and why they surprise you. So, for example, it is surprising to me that the application asks questions if somebody in the household has a felony. I don't understand why somebody who is applying for food or hunger relief would need to share that there's somebody in the house that has a felony, because that person's criminal record has nothing to do with somebody buying chicken or snacks or whatever it is they want to buy. So that's the one that stood out to me. That's an example. Really tell me what stood out to you. Tell me why. 3 that you would like to pull out, and we will go from there. We'll bring it back to class and discuss further. So that's the homework. It shouldn't take you too long, but it is worth looking at that application, please, because it's surprising. Thank you so much, everyone, and I will see you in the very last class. We are bringing back the Biggest Little Farm, The Return. Okay, bye.